Good morning. Wow, thank you so much for coming out. It's great to see so many faces for this incredible panel that's been the one that I've been looking forward to all summer so far. So my name is Kira Loughran. I'm the associate producer for the forum at Stratford. And it is my great pleasure to welcome this distinguished panel for our CBC Massey Lectures Discovery event, The Discovery of Human Rights. As some of you might know, CBC Radio's Ideas program has been partnering with the Forum this year, presenting a really exceptional series of programs and panels that are being recorded for future broadcast on CBC Radio Ideas. It's been a really fruitful partnership for us, a lot of shared values around the role of culture, the need to discuss and have conversations about the way that society intersects with culture, technology, and human beings. So it's been a really great partnership. I'd like to thank Philip Coulter and Paul Kennedy and Greg Kelly for making it happen. This event is being live streamed, so if you want to share it with friends later, you can tell them to go to our website and watch. Our panelists today, I'll let Paul do larger intros, but briefly, Sally Armstrong, journalist and author, Stephen Lewis, the humanitarian, and former everything.
Or more accurately, everything in my life is former.
And Payam Akavan, international human rights lawyer, and of course our moderator, Paul Kennedy. For today's event, our ushers will be handing out pieces of paper and pencils. If you have questions, you can write them down. Paul will get the ushers to collect them at a certain point after we've had some introductory comments, and we'll work them into our conversation as the event goes on. So I think without further ado, Paul Kennedy, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Kira. I know that we're all here actually to hear the panelists, and so I don't want to take up too much time off the top. But I just want to say, repeat actually, because I've said it at all the sessions so far this summer, and I'll continue. It is a great, great pleasure to be here as part of this partnership between the Stratford Festival and Ideas. And one thing that strikes me every time I come in here is that we're actually at the beginning, believe it or not. I sometimes have to pinch myself. Ideas is now beginning its 50th season on radio in Canada. And it just strikes me that this kind of partnership between what I believe is truly a central, absolutely essential Canadian cultural institution with another is a good way for us to begin those celebrations. We're beginning them today as part of this series that Ideas has put together with the Massey lecturers and two other guests, talking about discovery, because discovery is the theme of the entire festival season this year. And we've so far talked about the discovery of self, we've talked about the discovery of other worlds, we've talked about the discovery of democracy, and we'll continue. This is the discovery of human rights, which I would put to you is in some ways almost a profoundly Shakespearean topic, in that it involves looking hard at some of the darkest aspects of human nature, as well as looking at the same time almost at some of the most hopeful or brightest aspects of human nature. And it's that we'll be discussing in the context of this voyage into the world of human rights. I'm delighted also to be here today because I'm truly among friends. I know all three panelists at various levels of friendship, but by way of introducing them, and again briefly because I know you want to hear them, not me, Sally Armstrong is going to kick things off this morning. I've known Sally for not a long time, for 5 or 6 years. She pitched two ideas, which was not irrelevant to the topic that we're talking about today. And she pitched it to me. I said immediately yes. She'd never done a radio show before. Off she went with the tape recorder, came back with unbelievable tape, which I sort of processed, and we made our first radio program together. Then she called me about a year later and said, guess what, Paul, I'm going to Afghanistan, and I'm going to do a program about young women and what they're doing in Afghanistan to establish human rights. Do you think I should take a tape recorder? And I didn't pause long before I said yes, although I think I also added, Sally, be careful. You're going to Afghanistan. Now, what do I find out when she comes back? Sally was spotted on the roof of a building in the center of Kandahar, I believe, and there were helicopters hovering overhead because I had instructed her to get sound effects for the documentary. She was standing with a microphone like that. Such is her commitment not only to human rights but to telling the stories of human rights. And I invite Sally to go to the podium and open the conversation today.
Well, thank you, Paul. Thank you for leaving out some of the stories. And it's a pleasure to be here. You know, this is a topic, of course, that's dear to the hearts of the people sitting in front of you today. And indeed, we can celebrate the fact that human rights now are really part of the lexicon of common language, even in places like Afghanistan. And it's true, as I think the brochure said, oppression, genocide, slavery are not acceptable today, but they happen. That's where we are at this stage. I mean, even in this wonderful country of ours. In this wonderful country of ours, a man in bountiful British Columbia can have 25 wives. He can have an ovulation chart on the wall so he knows who to have sex with. He can have 100 children, more than 100 children, in fact, and collect tax payments for all of them. So we also have a distance to travel. In fact, in our own wonderful country, as you know, there's between 1,200 and 1,500 missing or murdered Aboriginal women. Where are their human rights in a country with a government that says they don't need an inquiry around these women? So we do, in fact, have a distance to travel. But you know, there is a new twist in accessing human rights, at least for the people I talk to. And I talk to women in places like Afghanistan, like Congo, like Gaza, and they know about human rights. What they want to know is how to get them for themselves. You know, I sometimes think that the men of Afghanistan have this bizarre notion that if you give women human rights, you have to give up a man's human rights. It's a bit crazy, don't you think? But the research I did for my book, Ascent of Women, A New Age is Dawning for Every Mother's Daughter, demonstrates there is a change in the way women are attempting to claim these rights for themselves. Let me explain. We used to rely on political will and public will to make change in the workplace or even the home. You remember that the political will would be getting that politician to sign the law into action, and public will is all those marches and petitions that we all signed, led, I dare say, by Michelle Landsberg, who's sitting here this morning. But it was the stroke of the politician's pen or the power of the people on the street that we relied on. And indeed, judges in places like the criminal court who signed into law the fact that rape is a war crime. We know about that. But what is different today is a new force that is propelling human rights to, I believe, a new height. And this is the effect of personal will. Women the world over are fed up with waiting for politicians to do what needs to be done. I believe women the world over are fed up with putting women into shelters and marching in protest against rape and signing petitions so that we have our share of the democracy, whatever it is. And maybe it's because of the change in education around the world. The issue of personal will, from where I'm standing, has taken over the stage, and it's playing a very powerful role today. An example would be Malala Yousafzai. Now here's a kid, you know her story. She decided she was going to go to school in the Swat Valley, Pakistan, and was shot in the head for her trouble. But that kid went to school not because a politician in the Swat Valley said girls must go to school, and not because there was a public protest in the Swat Valley saying, why aren't our girls in school? Malala went to school because she wanted to go to school. She insisted on going to school. And indeed, when they shot her in the head, she got better eventually, and she went back to school, and she started a movement. Her reaction to what happened to her spread all over the world. Malala Yousafzai became the world's daughter, and she got there because of personal will. There's another story that exemplifies, I believe, this change, which is where I believe human rights are moving today. In Kenya, there's a well-known case of 160 little girls between the ages of 3 and 17, and they sued their government for failing to protect them from being raped. Absolutely unheard of. Well, that didn't start because of a public protest. It didn't start because a politician felt something should be done about this dreadful impunity for men raping little girls in Kenya. They do have laws on the book. They call it defilement, by the way. But hardly anyone ever gets charged. Hardly anyone ever goes to jail. This case began because a 12-year-old girl called Millie stood up at a village meeting near Meru, and she said, I want to go to school. And I can't go to school because I'm pregnant. And I'm pregnant because that man sitting over there raped me. This is personal will. And indeed, this precedent-setting case, when they won it, which they did, they won it for 10 million girls in Kenya. It's now certainly about both political will and public will. Everyone from politicians to the public is on board trying to retrain the judiciary of Meru and trying to make sure that the lives of those girls have indeed been changed. You see, women and girls are talking today in a way they didn't talk before about their rights. They've broken the taboo on speaking out about sexual assault. And everyone knows if you don't talk about it, you don't change it. Now they're talking, even in Congo, it was the women who coined the phrase, silence is violence. This is what's going on today, because you know, the earth has shifted under the status of women and girls. And that shift is propelling changes so immense, it is said they will affect intractable files such as poverty, such as conflict. They may even bring a true accounting to very intractable files like culture and religion. Even the economists have weighed in. Jeffrey Sachs, the Millennium Goals economist, he's the one who said the status of women and the economy are directly related. Where one's flourishing, so is the other. Where one's in the ditch, so is the other. That is the talk that's altering the human rights landscape that I see. The relationship between political will, public will, and personal will is what's doing it. You know, political will may lag behind, public will may surge ahead or even retreat, but what salvages both of them is the person who stands up and says, this is what I want. This is Millie. This is Malala. That electrifies the public and the political. And this is where social media is igniting the entire conversation today. When you look at this as binary, political and public together, it needs to be pushed by the personal, the individual who says, this is what I want. And you know, human rights law, equality law, gender advocacy depend on people today saying these things. And social media gives easy access to their stories. Social media inspires people. It lets people tell the whole story, the whole heart and soul of the story. That's because when people put their stories up on Facebook or Twitter or even Tumblr, they are telling what happened to them. And this provides momentum and a more powerful case for the public to sweep the issue toward political will. You know, I don't believe we should let politicians off the hook, so I'm not dismissing political will at all. In fact, I think politicians get away with way too much anyhow. And I do believe very strongly in public will. I mean, look at the organization called Women Living Under Muslim Laws. This is the juggernaut that is making change for women in Asia and Africa and indeed the Middle East. But I do think, to kick off what I want to contribute today, I think it's personal will that's the leading game changer in the next step to the discovery of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. I suppose it should come as no surprise to anybody. I actually met these three friends all in the context of making radio programs. I, of course, knew who Stephen Lewis was when I met him. He'd been the opposition leader in the legislature in Toronto. I met him in the context of the fact that we were both working on a radio program about Stanley Knowles. And I remember actually going to Ottawa with Stephen and doing an interview with Stanley. That is one of the most, I didn't do the interview, I just sat there and recorded it, but it's one of the most memorable interviews that in my entire career. While we were working on that program, I got a very interesting telephone call from Stephen one night, and he said, Paul, I can't come to the production meeting tomorrow, and I can't tell you why I can't come to the production meeting tomorrow. And I scratched my head and said, well, okay, that's what's going to happen. We can't do anything about it. And of course, the next morning on the front page of the Globe and Mail, it was announced that Brian Mulroney had appointed Stephen Lewis to be Canada's ambassador to the United Nations. And I believe at that time he had to trade in his brown corduroy suits for other suits and moved into it. The rest, of course, is some kind of amazing history where Stephen went from being Canada's ambassador to basically being one of the spokespeople for Africa on behalf of the UN and the Secretary General. We next crossed paths in a more major way, and the reason that Stephen is here today is when he delivered the Massey Lectures a few years back, and we literally crossed the country from coast to coast, Stephen talking about the crisis in Africa. And I believe the book that resulted from that Massey Lecture series and tour stayed on several bestsellers lists in Canada, Maclean's and the Globe and Mail, also in the United States, the New York Times, for months and months and months. Stephen needs no introduction, and I've already wasted his time by giving him this one. Please welcome Stephen Lewis.
Thank you, everyone. And I'm going to speak with almost supernatural rapidity in order to force into a short time that which I would like to disgorge. I really, truly appreciated what Sally said. And I think this question of personal will has become increasingly predominant internationally, although I think it also has a tendency to be romanticized from time to time because the struggles at the grassroots are continuing to be so overwhelming. For me, the single most important human right yet to be achieved is gender equality. That's where the struggle must be focused. I'm perfectly willing and entirely happy to acknowledge the extraordinary progress that has been made both in the Western world and many parts of the underdeveloping world. But there is an irony at work here for me in any event, which is that the place which should be the heart of human rights is not performing well, and that's the United Nations itself. And I'm one of those people who feels that the political agitation required, the political leadership required, is nowhere in evidence, and that it's heartbreaking and painful to watch the diminution of gender equality because the United Nations so lamentably fails to perform. We spent years attempting to create, and finally did create, something called United Nations Women, the first international agency for women, and now it's being willfully starved by the same countries which created it, and can barely do the job for which it was designed. When it comes to sex trafficking, when it comes to child marriage, when it comes to HIV/AIDS, the reality of the extraordinary discrimination and prejudice still visited upon women is absolutely overwhelming. And there is a kind of paralysis at the heart of the human rights mandate within the multilateral system, within the United Nations system, in responding to those truths. But worst of all, if I may say, is the pandemic of sexual violence worldwide. I don't know whether people here have read the recent report, fascinating report, terrifying report in the New York Times on the theology of rape, which ISIS has now propounded and is spreading through the countries which it increasingly dominates, using rape not merely as a vehicle of war, but as an actual theology based in religious scripture. I think of what's happening to those girls in Boko Haram, who will never be made whole again. I think of what is happening in the Congo. Sally made an appropriate reference to what the women of the Congo are saying, but if you look at the worst part of the Congo, around sexual violence, the eastern Congo, the city of Bukavu, where Dr. Denis Mukwege runs the Panzi Hospital, which deals with the surgical repair of reproductive tracts of women after they have been savagely raped. Denis Mukwege will tell you today that things have never been worse. They continue to decline even as we say progress is being made. And if you pick up the New York Times today, you'll read of the growing ascendance of the Taliban in many parts of Afghanistan, using the worst oppressive dimensions of women about which we read. So for me, in any event, this is a struggle non pareil. And it is not only individual will which must be brought to bear, but it is also the work of NGOs. I agree with Sally. Getting these governments mobilized, getting the UN mobilized drives you crazy. And there has to be the capacity of non-governmental organizations to do a job. So I'm going to very quickly tell you a personal little saga, which is not meant to be self-centered. It's meant to be descriptive. Forgive me if it sounds self-centered, but I was fascinated by it myself. I work with an organization called AIDS Free World. We learned over time, obviously, that where there's sexual violence, you have transmission of the virus. And my co-director of AIDS Free World, a woman named Paula Donovan, who lives in Boston, had been pushing us to do more and more work on sexual violence, and then herself discovered that the United Nations peacekeepers in countries where they are supposed to be protecting civilians were themselves engaging in sexual violence. And more astonishingly, there is something called immunity, which is conferred on peacekeepers as a result of a 1946 Convention on Privileges and Immunities. So we decided, as a little NGO, to take these beggars on and to confront the United Nations directly and see if it was possible, as we deeply believe it is, to change public policy by an indefatigable, tenacious concentration on these pre-Paleolithic Neanderthals who run these bodies. So let me tell you very quickly what we did is we pulled out all the stops. We had a workshop at McGill in October last year where we brought 17 experts on peacekeeping and sexual violence in from around the world so that we would have a basic analysis of the problem. Number two, we began planning something called Code Blue, where we would ask for the end of immunity for sexual violence committed by United Nations peacekeepers in peacekeeping operation. Number three, when people heard about what we were doing, they began to leak material to us. Number four, therefore, when the story broke earlier this year of French peacekeepers who had sodomized and demanded oral sex from little 8- and 9-year-old boys in the Central African Republic, the report documenting those acts came to us, and Paula took it to The Guardian in the UK that published it on April 29th, and of course all hell broke loose internationally as everyone learned what had happened. Number five, by ironic timing, on May 13th, we held a press conference in New York on the removal of immunity, which was anchored by Graça Machel, the extraordinary figure in Africa, the widow of Nelson Mandela, and by our own General Romeo Dallaire. Number six, on May 29th, we published a leaked email chain from the senior officials within the United Nations. The heartbreaking part of it is that one of the people on that email chain was the Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva, whom I think is an extraordinarily otherwise effective personality. But the most senior people in the UN system had engaged in a cover-up, had effectively attempted to suppress what had happened in the Central African Republic so that it would never leak out that the United Nations had been delinquent, and they spoke of it not at all. It had occurred in May and June of 2014, and until the story broke in April of 2015, they kept it quiet. It was unbelievably reprehensible. Number seven, on June the 3rd, the Secretary General of the United Nations was forced to announce the setting up of review of the systematic inability to handle allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse within the UN family. And a number of governments, this was unprecedented, pressed the Secretary General to act because everyone was so horrified that the peacekeepers would be engaged in sexual violence. On June 23rd, the Secretary General, to forestall the humiliation of a resolution which was in the works at the United Nations, he announced a review of what had happened in the Central African Republic and of peacekeeping operations generally around sexual violence, chaired by Judge Marie Deschamps, our own judge, who did the investigation into the Canadian military. Number 9, more and more revelations began to emerge from Haiti, from Liberia, from a number of peacekeeping operations. Number 10, last week, there emerged the story of the 12-year-old girl in the Central African Republic who had been savagely raped at a house-to-house search by either a Rwandan or Cameroonian peacekeeper. It was not known exactly in Liberia, and the Secretary General was finally pressed to the wall. And all those prevaricators, dissemblers, fabricators who refused to tell the truth were forced to come to terms with the fact that governments had lost patience. And so the Secretary General earlier last week fired General Guy, Babacar Guy, the Secretary General's own representative in Liberia. He then held a public press conference, which he'd never done before, and said that the principle of zero tolerance would be observed. And then just yesterday, he had to call a special session of the Security Council to come clean about the UN's own delinquency. In other words, if you keep at this issue, if you never give quarter, if you recognize that the search for gender equality is the single most important issue on the planet, you can back the Philistines down. You can overcome the resistance. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Payam and I were talking just backstage about how we probably should have met long before we actually did. I was actually working again on a radio show. I think that's all I've ever done in my entire life. And I was actually in The Hague where Payam was working with the prosecution team in the early stages of the Yugoslavian war trials. We did not cross paths at that point. We crossed paths only a few years ago. Payam was born in Iran, came to Canada as a 9-year-old, was educated in Canada. He's a lawyer. He teaches at McGill. And he popped up on the interview list for a show that I was doing, and he literally blew my mind, although we never met in person until today. We met online at first. Then last year he delivered something quite appropriate or relevant to the conversation today. He delivered a lecture in Vancouver that is co-sponsored by the Laurier Institution and Ideas at CBC Radio and the University of British Columbia. It's the Human Rights Lecture. And we got a copy of the lecture. I couldn't go out to Vancouver to actually hear it in person. A copy came to Toronto. I listened to the lecture, and I was blown away. And a couple days later, we actually arranged to do an interview about that lecture. Again, I was stuck in Toronto. Payam was, I don't know if you were in Vancouver at that time, or Payam can be in Kenya or Haiti, or he travels around the world quite a bit. We did a conversation that, again, it didn't blow my mind, it blew my soul in this case. And what I found really touching about it was at the end of the interview, when I was trying to thank him, I broke down and started crying. And started sobbing uncontrollably. It was quite embarrassing. Thank goodness it was all on tape and therefore not usable. But what was wonderful is that I finally turned my microphone off and left the studio, and apparently what came down the line from wherever he was in the world into the control room of that studio in Toronto was, could somebody give Paul a hug? And that was great. We met at breakfast this morning, and Payam gave me that hug. I want you to invite, I should just say one more thing that's slightly relevant. This is a series based on Massey lecturers, and in 2018, Payam Akavan will be the Massey lecturer here in Canada.
Thank you, Paul, for that kind introduction. It's an honor to be here and together with two exceptional people here. And I remember when I was a student intern at the United Nations, and Stephen Lewis was our ambassador, wonderful ambassador. And one of the UN diplomats came up to me, seeing my enthusiasm, said, "Son, you will need 3 things to survive in the UN: Geritol, alcohol, and protocol." I thought it was funny too until I worked for the UN. So I'd like to pick up where our 2 excellent speakers started from, and to speak about the culture of accountability, or rather the culture of impunity against which there has been a sustained struggle since the early 1990s, when the United Nations for the first time established an international criminal tribunal to prosecute those that were responsible for ethnic cleansing in the former Yugoslavia. And of course, the first such experiment was after the Second World War, when the International Military Tribunal was established at Nuremberg to prosecute the top Nazi leaders. We have to bear in mind that there is a historical context here. Gibbons famously wrote that history is about the crimes, misfortunes, and follies of mankind. Human rights is a relatively youthful concept. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was only adopted in 1948. 70 years against some 4,000 years of written history is a whisper in the passage of time. And the idea of accountability for human rights violations is even more recent. After the Nuremberg Tribunal, the United Nations for 40 years failed to even begin to challenge this culture of impunity. And one case in point was Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, that between 1975 and 79 killed, tortured to death, starved to death, worked to death, an estimated 2 million people in Cambodia, and were roundly condemned by the international community until the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia made Pol Pot into a useful instrument in the context of Cold War power struggles. So the Khmer Rouge was actively rehabilitated and participated in UN-sponsored elections in Cambodia in 1993, a bit like having the Nazi Party participate in elections in post-war Germany with UN blessing. That is just one instance of the sordid culture of impunity which witnessed the likes of Idi Amin and Mengistu and many others commit genocide without any fear of accountability. The Yugoslav Tribunal was initially established as a paper tiger, as a fig leaf to cover the inaction of the international community in the face of ethnic cleansing in the former Yugoslavia. It was only accidentally that it became an effective institution when 60,000 NATO peacekeepers in Bosnia realized that prosecuting the warlords wasn't just a question of lofty human rights ideals, but it was integral to post-conflict governance. It was integral to achieving stability. Given the fact that ethnic wars and genocides are not spontaneous outbursts of tribal hatred, as the media often presents them to be, but that behind every conflict is what we would like to call an ethnic entrepreneur. The instrumentalization of hatred and violence as an instrument of power. Warren Zimmerman, the last US ambassador in Belgrade during the time of Milosevic, famously said that the case of the former Yugoslavia was not a case of spontaneous combustion. There was plenty of historical tinders, but pyromaniacs were required. And those were the ethno-nationalist demagogues that used ethnic hatred as a means of ripping the country apart, only so that they could keep themselves in power. The precedent established by the Yugoslav Tribunal was followed by the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda after the horrific genocide in 1994, and this created the context for the establishment, finally, of the International Criminal Court, the statute of which was adopted in 1998. The International Criminal Court has been somewhat of a disappointment for reasons perhaps too complex for me to explain in such a short presentation. But we have today, finally, with all its shortcomings, an institution, a permanent institution, dedicated to the task of holding political and military leaders responsible for crimes against humanity and genocide, including most notably violence against women, which is invariably a feature of all forms of mass violence. But I want to step back and actually speak about the limits of international criminal justice, the limits of accountability, as someone who spent his whole career developing such institutions. We have to appreciate, as Hannah Arendt said after the Nuremberg judgment, that these crimes explode the limits of the law. I left The Hague 10 years after my initial engagement with the International Criminal Tribunal with a sense of utter futility, even if professionally it was a very rewarding experience, having been in Bosnia, having been in Rwanda and Guatemala and Cambodia, and having had intimate encounters with those whose lost were destroyed forever. One begins to understand that you cannot bring back the dead, that while justice is important, while it's important to change the culture of impunity, to try and prevent further violence, that we have to look at why these instances of mass violence erupt in the first place. I turn briefly to the case of Rwanda. We speak about genocide in the same way as we speak about earthquakes and tsunamis, as a God-given disaster, as something which is somehow inevitable. I would like to challenge that proposition. Genocide is a political choice. It takes months of preparation, tremendous amounts of resources. In the case of Rwanda, the media only took notice in April of 1994 when the masses of bodies were piling up on the streets and rivers of Rwanda. But the incubator of the genocide had begun many months earlier, and one institution in particular that was indispensable for the mobilization of hundreds of thousands of génocidaires who, unlike the Nazi death camps, were individually killing people with clubs and machetes. One vital instrument was the radio, RTLM, Radio Télévision Libre des Mille Collines. It would have been impossible to mobilize hundreds of thousands of illiterate rural people in Rwanda without that radio station. My dear friend Romeo Dallaire had called for reinforcements, for more UN peacekeepers. I would like to suggest that had that radio station be shut down, we may not have witnessed the Rwandan genocide. We have to measure success in the human rights world by what does not happen. We have to measure success by what never becomes breaking news, headline news, or on the agenda of the UN Security Council. And this is where we have to understand that justice, human rights, is first and foremost not about legal institutions, but it's more than anything about transforming the rules of power and legitimacy. We also have to understand that punishing perpetrators, while important, will only give a limited measure of relief to those that have suffered unspeakably. Some time ago, the mothers of Khavaran is a mass grave in the south of Tehran, the city of my birth, where thousands of those that were executed by the Islamic Republic were unceremoniously dumped. The mothers that met there created a group called the Mothers of Khavaran as they mourned their loved ones. They came to me, they said, "You're the big law professor, you're the former UN prosecutor, could you please do some justice for our children?" There was a moment where I felt totally impotent because I had to tell them that there was no jurisdiction that would hear their case. We decided instead to set up a truth commission in exile. And in 2012, in 2 sessions in London and The Hague, together with eminent jurists and with the testimony of 100 witnesses, we put together a prosecution of the Islamic Republic of Iran for the mass execution of thousands and thousands of people merely on grounds of their political and religious belief. And it was extraordinary to see how important it was for those mothers not necessarily to see someone go to prison, but to simply be able to tell their story, to be able to share their pain and suffering. And it was extraordinary to see how the testimony of a mother who spoke about how each of her 4 children had been executed and who wept moved an entire nation to the point where even an authoritarian system that had denied these executions finally had to admit that they had taken place. And turning to the theme of gender equality, I want to end by speaking about the different definition of power that people like the mothers of Havaran, or the mothers of Srebrenica in Bosnia, or the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina have shown us. There is no force more powerful than a mother who has lost her child. She will stop at nothing to demand justice. And the problem perhaps is sometimes that we underestimate our own power, and we wring our hands in resignation and despair at the corruption of political power. But I would end by quoting the Anglo-Irish statesman Edmund Burke, who famously said, "All that it takes for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing." And we are all part of that equation, and there is nothing inevitable about these evils. We all have a role to play. Thank you very much.
Well, the panelists have now thrown down the gauntlet, and it is now our turn to pick it up and continue the conversation. As Kira said off the top, ushers will be circulating through the House to get your written questions. They'll hand you pencils and paper to do that, so please jot them down, and they'll be handed up to me. I'll feed them into the conversation as soon as possible. To make that happen, though, I'll begin with a couple of fairly simple questions. Payam, you point out that the Universal Declaration didn't come until the late 40s, that we've only had 70 some odd years of what might be called human rights activism or human rights legal response. Why did it happen when it happened, and what was the source? This is a question for everyone, and please, these panelists, as you can tell, are capable of talking amongst themselves, and I will sort of disappear from the conversation if possible, but what was the motivation for this seemingly revolutionary tipping point in the history of human rights?
Well, it was an unprecedented war with catastrophic consequences. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Genocide Convention, which were the two first instruments adopted by the UN in 1948, were all adopted in the wake of the Holocaust. And there was an interesting debate between Habermas, who spoke about the Nazi atrocities as residual barbarity, almost as if there's a sort of pre-modern barbarity which explained this genocide. And then Zygmunt Bauman, who said that the Holocaust was at home in modernity, that the Holocaust was very much a reflection of modernity, and it shattered the illusion that we had that without a moral compass, without a spiritual core, that civilization can progress based on science and technology. And I would add that the predecessors to the Universal Declaration, I think, have to be understood in context. The French Declaration on the Rights of Man, and it's called the Declaration on the Rights of Man, adopted in 1789, because it did not apply to women. Women did not have the vote in France until 1945. They didn't have the vote in Switzerland until 1971, in Liechtenstein until 1986. So that's the context, and we have to bear in mind that France was an imperial power until the 1960s and 70s. Or the Virginia Bill of Rights, the American Revolution. The founders of the American Revolution were A, slave owners, and B, had no compunctions about the extermination and mass deportation of indigenous peoples in the 19th century. So when you look at human rights not as an abstraction, but in proper context, you realize that we have a long way to go, and that it is exceptionally inspiring that we are having this conversation, because we would not have been having this conversation 1 or 2 generations ago.
You know, you raise such an interesting point when we're looking at the birth of modern human rights in the Declaration, but you're mentioning the trials at Nuremberg. You know, there's new research out about the sexual, what is this doing? The sexual assault of women during the Holocaust in the camps. And do you know their stories were available to the judges at Nuremberg, and the judges said, I don't want my courtroom full of bawling women. We're not doing it. So exactly what both of you mentioned, there's this oppression of women that is there forever. We seem to need to sandblast that out, even from judges who are looking at the worst the worst event we'd ever seen.
I was thinking while you were talking, Payam, and back to Sally's opening about personal will, because the Declaration of Human Rights was in significant measure part of personal will, because there was a woman named Eleanor Roosevelt who at 10 after 2 a.m. on the morning of December 10th, 1948, gavelled the conclusion of the conference and said, "The long, hard job done." And if Eleanor Roosevelt had not been chairing the discussions of the Declaration, I'm not at all sure that it would have come to pass. I mean, it does show the power of the individual when taking hold. And it's fascinating you mentioned Nuremberg and the sexual assaults, because out of the genocide in Rwanda, there came hundreds of women who had suffered terrible sexual assaults, forming themselves into something called the Polyclinique d'Espoir, and meeting with those women and hearing what had been done to them, and the inability for the state to respond and the world to respond was, I must admit, for me, it was a kind of turning point. I have never felt more vividly aghast at the world's impotence and its refusal to respond. You mentioned Radio Mille Collines in Rwanda. I want to remind everyone here that on January the 11th, 1994, 2 months before the genocide began, Romeo Dallaire, February, March, 3 months before the genocide began, Romeo Dallaire sent a telegram to New York begging for the right to get rid of the cache of arms all over Kigali, the capital of Rwanda, and the UN turned him down flat. And if he had been able to do what he asked to do, he would have stopped the genocide with or without Radio Mille Collines. And I mention it only because everybody has apologized for that genocide. Bill Clinton, Kofi Annan, France, Belgium, everyone except the Catholic Church. The only group on the planet that was deeply involved in the genocide that never apologized, and we can't get them to apologize despite the new Pope. It's interesting in terms of human rights.
And if I could just add, Stephen, one of the tragedies is that all of those that actively blocked attempts to do anything were subsequently promoted.
Exactly. Exactly.
Madeleine Albright was the U.S. ambassador
Yeah.
to the United Nations at the time. She became Secretary of State. Susan Rice, who's now the Clinton in the Obama administration. I mean, Kofi Annan, and so on and so forth. And sometimes we also have to understand that the price of true success is not to be promoted, is to forego the temptations of power.
Well, they all. May I ask? Incidentally, the man who said no to General Dallaire's request, a man called Iqbal Riza from Pakistan, became Secretary of the Cabinet immediately after the genocide for Kofi Annan. You're quite right, the promotions were constant. Can I ask a question? In terms of the International Criminal Court, more and more, of course, it is inevitably focused on some of the African leadership, like al-Bashir in Sudan, who deserve to be indicted. And now the Africans are saying that they want collectively, led by Kenya, whose leaders were also indicted, to withdraw from the International Criminal Court, to establish their own court in Africa, which will ultimately, I think, be farcical, because they've already provided immunity for any head of state. So what happens to the International Criminal Court under these pressures, Payam?
Well, the International Criminal Court, perhaps as a romantic concept, was very appealing until people felt its bite. And this is, I think, part of it's sort of like organ transplant. I think the body is not able to accept the transplant; it's trying to reject it, and it's going to take some time before we shift the culture of international politics. The Yugoslav Tribunal and the Rwanda Tribunal were ad hoc tribunals. They were the first time ever that political leaders were held accountable, and it was acceptable so long it was ad hoc. It was leaders of marginalized countries or deposed regimes. And now you're establishing an international criminal court, which is a permanent institution, which is an attempt to mainstream and regularize accountability. So we shouldn't be surprised at the pushback. What is disappointing, however, is that with respect to Bashir, the UN Security Council referred the case to the ICC, but the ICC was never given any support to actually effect that arrest. And international criminal tribunals are a bit like giants with no arms and no legs. They depend entirely on governments to execute their arrest warrants, and without political pressure, without political leaders taking accountability seriously, the courts will become paper tigers.
I, as you see, have a number of questions, which we won't have time to get them all in, so I'm going to switch immediately now to the questions from the audience. The first one moves from the international sphere to something slightly more local. Is there any way to insert these important issues into the banal political dialogues of the United States and Canada?
You answer
You know what? I
In our backyard, 40% of Aboriginal children go hungry, and that's just shameful. So we can't just imagine that to be engaged meaningfully in human rights struggles, we have to go out there in Rwanda and the Central African Republic, right here in our own backyard. There are very pressing issues, and it's really a function of our own communities making these election issues. Say that we will only vote for someone that promises to end child hunger, someone that promises to end the violence against Aboriginal women, and so on and so forth. But when politicians can engage so successfully in fear-mongering and appealing to our sense of greed and self-absorption, then we get what we deserve.
We have a seat open. There is a there is a constituency in Montreal that is not. We'll talk afterwards.
Is this the Republican Party, Steve?
Moving now to the international plane. For those of us who still love the ideal of the United Nations, is there any promise? What can individual Canadians do to support it to be more effective?
Well, may I take a first crack at that? Because I know that I've often felt self-conscious about speaking mournfully about the United Nations because I believe in multilateralism and I want it to work. I think it's important to divide the United Nations into the two halves. One is the work of the agencies, the UNICEFs, the World Food Programs, the United Nations Development Program, the WHOs, etc., which do some extraordinary work on the ground and are indispensable and invaluable to improving the human condition in countries all over the world. And they're very much worthy of support, and they're very much worthy of talking about in relatively positive and exuberant terms. I mean, they can make errors, of course, but by and large, they do important and good work. It's when you focus on the Security Council and the General Assembly and the United Nations' inability to deal with human rights and to deal with Libya and Syria and Iraq and the Congo and Central African Republic and South Sudan and the endless litany of carnage and hatred in the world, and the fact that the Security Council is so locked into paralysis by virtue of the 5 permanent members. All of these things make that side of the UN tough and makes people very cynical, myself included. I get very cynical about that. But the agencies do terrific work, and that should be enough to encourage people to support the UN.
I have a feeling about the UN that we tend to speak in terms of we and they. They are the UN, we are not. We are the UN. We are every bit of the UN. And I think we need to reclaim the ownership of that institution to frankly, I think, reshape it. I guess you can't tear it down because you'd never have had this agreement in the first place if you didn't make all these accommodations. But I think it's going to take all of us speaking up and being more involved in making our demands known, because they do tend to behave as though they're not accountable to people like me or you. And I agree with you, the work they're doing on the ground is many times excellent, but there is also a sense of we and they.
Yes.
And especially if you're a reporter, nobody likes reporters, but UN people, they don't want you hanging around. And I think we have to be more transparent, and I think we as the public have to understand that we are the UN.
You know, that's a really interesting point, because in truth, we're the employers of the UN bureaucracy. The nation states are the people who should be making the decisions. And forgive me if this sounds faintly political. I'm trying desperately to suppress my natural perverse antagonisms. But take a country like Canada, which had, I think Payam would acknowledge, a tremendous international reputation. It really did. We were seen as a moderate middle power on whom people relied. We used to provide peacekeeping troops. We provided a much greater percentage of our gross national product for foreign aid. We supported good causes. And now we're actually a pariah at the UN. We were defeated by Portugal for a Security Council seat. It was ridiculous. And it's because of our stand on climate change. It's because of our stand on the Middle East. It's because of our refusal to participate in so much of the work of the UN. And it's crazy, because Canada could be a real voice and a real force internationally and begin, as Sally says, to reclaim the integrity of the institution. It's heartbreaking to see what we've relinquished. How many people in this audience can give me the name of the Canadian ambassador to the United Nations? Aha. And well, I mean, it's and don't press me too hard on that very question.
This is a question that, well, you just used the word, Stephen, but it strikes me it was a sort of elephant in the room question. What's the role of climate change in human rights? And the example they give is climate change refugees.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
What's the role of climate change in human rights in the contemporary world? And specifically, they're talking about refugees from climate problems.
Well, I'll open it up and then be appropriately corrected or altered. We're going to have, we have at the moment 50 million refugees and internally displaced people in the world, the highest number it's ever been, largely because of conflict and poverty and the simple, terrible vulnerability of large populations. But there's no question that the rising sea levels in particular and the climatic episodes we've all witnessed are driving more and more people out of their homes and into other parts of countries. A country like Bangladesh, the South Pacific Islands, even parts of the Caribbean. If the sea level rise continues, the polar caps continue to evaporate, whole sections of countries will disappear beneath the waves. I can remember the president of the Maldives saying that they were going to be purchasing more and more land in India in order to move the entire population of the country because they would soon disappear beneath the waves. So not only are you going to have shifting agricultural patterns, terrible droughts, conflict over water, and all of the engendered sadness or difficulty of climate change and global warming, with countries like Canada and Australia and others refusing to participate in the reduction of carbon. But you're going to have millions upon millions of refugees, and the world has no idea how it's going to deal with them. It's extraordinary. No one is thinking that through.
If I could just add to what Stephen has said, I was in Bangladesh actually some time ago, exactly in the region, in the Sundarban, where the rising sea level is swallowing whole islands, and visibly every year. And in Bangladesh alone, within the coming decades, there will be 50 million displaced people. Yeah. So the figure that you gave of 50 million refugees globally will be replicated in Bangladesh alone, let alone all the other countries in the world. And we speak about human rights in terms of victims of torture, political prisoners, But there's a whole other side to human dignity, which goes to social and economic rights. And we sort of don't want to talk about that part of human rights. But according to Oxfam, presently the richest 60 people in the world have as much wealth as the bottom 3.5 billion people. These are Oxfam studies, very respectable studies. And within the coming years, the top 1% of the world's population will have more wealth than the remaining 99%, meaning to say they will have more than 50% of global wealth. So we look with horror at ideologies such as Nazism and Stalinism and the toll that they've taken on humankind. But we also have an ideology, it's called consumerism. It's an ideology which is a bit like a cancer, which is just eating away at the environment, at the cohesion of our societies, at our sense of justice and decency. And this goes back to our political culture. How do politicians win votes? It's all about taxes, it's all about monetary value rather than moral and spiritual values. And we're reaching a point where we will have no choice but to put under very serious question and scrutiny this ideology of greed and self-absorption and the toll that it is taking and the potentially catastrophic results that await us if we don't arrest this process.
I don't. I have to say that I agree entirely, but the ideology is called capitalism. It's not consumerism. It's capitalism.
I was waiting for you to say that,
I
Steve.
thought you. I assumed you were, and you probably were waiting for me to say what I am now about to say, which is that there's a remarkable writer, journalist, thinker named Naomi Klein, who has written a book called This Changes Everything, which is the exact conjunction of climate and capitalism, and how you cannot deal with climate change until you deal with capitalism, or more profoundly, until you deal with inequality, which is the emblematic triumph of capitalism. The Oxfam report you describe was released at the World Economic Forum in January, where the richest potentates of the world gather to shed crocodile tears about poverty. This is, I'm just too damned old. It drives me crazy that I don't have another 77 years to keep fighting. But these are tremendous battles that have to be fought. I'm completely with Sally and Payam on this. This is a matter of mobilizing publics, of all of us getting involved. It's crazy to see what is being done to this world by the system of capitalism and other isms that are destroying humankind. It drives you crazy, and it shouldn't be happening in our own country, God damn it. It should not be happening in Canada.
I want to add something. I love what you say. I want to add perhaps an unpopular view on whether or not climate change has to do with human rights. I agree with every word you said, and I think we need to tackle that. I would prefer it be under some other umbrella, maybe crime, because I devote my career to issues around women, and it seems to me every time we get some traction, another thing comes up to push us back. Wherever I speak today, and I'm talking about the number of women, young girls being educated that were not educated before, and if they're not the turning point, I don't know what is. And I never meet an audience that doesn't say, well, what about the boys? Mm-hmm. Every time you find a way to move the women forward, another heavier or newer or trendier topic, and I'm not calling climate change trendy, but I regret that now, and we're talking that way, climate change being a human right, I would rather it go under another umbrella, along with capitalism and all those things that Naomi has been saying, and let's keep that gender thing to a human right that still hasn't been realized for almost half the world.
The problem, That's really interesting. So what do you do about the reality of climate change, which is that women will feel its impact
Well, we will.
overwhelmingly more than men will feel
We
its
will,
impact?
except I think there's a higher level that already exists in a court. That's crime. You polluted this, you ruined that, you caused that, you're responsible. And, you know, I remember a person who was involved in, what was it called, the United Nations, I don't know, it wasn't climate change, an earlier version. And he was talking to me about packaging. And he said in Germany, somebody came up with the idea that if you made people responsible for packaging, there would be a lot less packaging. If you had to pay to put it in your garbage, you wouldn't want to bring it home. So and I can't remember the name of the man that started this in Germany. He said, leave it at the store. Can you imagine? And I mean, you can't even open packages that you buy at Shoppers Drug Mart today. You need scissors or saws, perhaps.
Yes.
But if you left it behind, if you start shifting the blame, I think people want to make money. They don't want me leaving my garbage at Shoppers Drug Mart. So I think it's a crime, maybe.
I'm happy to designate it as a crime, and put all the aristocracy in jail. That would be that would be you can see that I'm losing control.
If I could just add to what Sally has said, I think we have to understand that women's rights aren't just about women. Women's rights are also a man's problem. And the reason I say this is I think about Carol Gilligan, for example, the studies in psychology which show how the socialization of girls and boys affects them. And those things are replicated in the consumer capitalist culture, the conception of power that we have, and the very egotistic worldview which has these very real material consequences. And Carol Gilligan explains how the inability to form emotional bonds is at the root of male violence. So I think that the emancipation of women is also about the emancipation of men. And it's also about creating a culture of fulfillment and contentment rather than a culture of greed which creates the illusion of happiness. And one of the extraordinary things is all of us travel to these poor countries. We see terrible things, but there are also people with a profound sense of self despite their poverty. Mm-hmm. And then we look at the incidence of anxiety and depression in our rat race, where we chase after happiness, but it's always around the corner. So I think that we need to also understand that our relation to suffering, our relation to helping others, is not a case of noblesse oblige, of us doing a favor for those that suffer. We also suffer from emptiness, and we need to give to be able to experience what fulfillment and happiness is about. And I will just end by saying, well, the last thing I want to say is, I have a friend who is in adventure tourism. He takes people in the Mongolian desert to live in tents with the nomads, and he charges them tens of thousands of dollars. Or all these, bankers from London and New York that are experiencing the pain of emptiness. They have bought their 50th yacht, their 6th private jet, and they have their 7th mistress, and they don't know what to do with themselves. So what do? They want to buy authenticity. They want to go into the desert and live in a tent to experience purity. And maybe that's the Zen economy of the future, where consuming less will be more.
Let me tell you a story. I was in Afghanistan, maybe for you. I was meeting with these women, they call themselves Young Women for Change, and my astonishment came from arriving in their little small cramped quarters and finding half of the members of this organization were young men. And I just experienced that in Cairo, the feminist center called Nazra, something like that. And I'd been there during a story I was doing on women of the Arab Spring. And to my astonishment, these young people, now both groups were young people, half of them were young men. And in both Kabul and Cairo, I asked the same question, what's with the guys? We didn't invite the guys to march with us in the 70s. And in both places, so Egypt and Afghanistan, I got the same answer, and it was, we will never get to the finish line unless we walk together, which is a huge lesson for this country as well. So I'm willing to accept that part. I'm just, I don't want to share my need for gender equality until we have it better settled.
Well, Well, you know, I'm sure you have the same experience that when one is talking about gender equality, one of the first questions from the audience always is, what about the men?
Yeah.
Always. I just don't have much time for that, to tell you the truth. I'm married to Michelle Landsberg, who's sitting over there, and so I have, apart from anything else, my socialism is infused with feminism, which would never have been true otherwise, and I have learned in the process that the education of young boys is at the heart of changing the society. Exactly. And that's what we're not doing in a very significant way. And it's so interesting because it's so difficult to galvanize men in very large numbers to respond the way you're talking about, the need for response, to overcome the pain of loneliness or emptiness or whatever it is that besieges them. But if we can begin to take seriously the need to educate young boys in a way that makes equality a watchword for them, that doesn't engage in the extraordinary stereotypes which are still characteristic of this society and others, we may over time be able to change it, because the women's movement on its side is doing a remarkable job. But by the way, just as a footnote to something you said, Payam, I've had a love affair with Africa for 55 years. And I love the continent largely because of the extraordinary generosity of spirit, the intrinsic decency, the extraordinary intelligence that lies at the grassroots and overwhelmingly amongst the women of Africa. And you want to go back again and again because it gives you the elixir of hope. You know that in the midst of everything, no matter how degraded and impoverished, the women of Africa will one day pull the continent together. It's time. It's time.
This question comes right back to Canada, and there's a journalistic rule. I've never really believed in this rule, but there's a rule that you're never supposed to ask a question of anybody that you don't already know the answer to it. At Ideas, we sort of work the other way, trying to find answers to questions we don't know the answers to. But I think I know what the answer to this question will be, but I'm going to throw it out anyway. What effect, if any, will Bill C-51 have on human rights?
No, you go.
No, you were gasping audibly. Go ahead.
You know, without giving away the stories I'm working on, I know I'll never get to the girls who are running off to join ISIS, but my hope is I'll get to their girlfriends and find out what they were saying before they left. In the process, I have been talking to people who are closer to the kinds of things, the radicalization videos, things like that, than I normally am. And I said to one of the leaders who was trying to get involved with these young people, the Muslim Women's Association of Canada are playing a great role in this. I said, I've never seen any of these radicalization videos. What are they like? He said, I certainly haven't seen any. I said, but you're working in this area. Why haven't you seen it? He said, because if it was ever found on my computer, I'd get arrested. So that kind of leads me into 51. As a journalist, there's a lot you have to worry about. I understand it also has to do with who you're supporting. Like if you're supporting one group that isn't seen as and I'm not talking about terrorists, a group that isn't seen as palatable by the government, you could also find yourself into trouble. So I have a big problem with C-51.
It's your turn. Well, maybe I'd like to speak more broadly about the politics of fear. And we talk about Yugoslavia, we talk about Rwanda. Of course, in Canada, we're far better off. But fear, sadly, works. The public can be manipulated to vote for this or that leader who appears tough on crime, tough on terrorism. And meanwhile, we have, let's say, the situation of Aboriginal women who are victims of unspeakable violence, but that is not really an issue because that sort of one hijab-clad woman that takes the oath of citizenship. She is the source of every threat that we face in society. So this is a part of the politics of fear. There are security threats, but they are then manipulated, exaggerated, misrepresented for achieving other objectives. But as someone who comes from the Middle East, who's lived in exile in this wonderful country for now most of his life, I think that we also have to remember that ISIS was not created overnight. And once again, we see these things out of historical context. ISIS was a long time in the making. There's this wonderful photograph of one Donald Rumsfeld shaking hands with one Saddam Hussein in 1983 in Baghdad when President Ronald Reagan asked him to hand-deliver a letter giving unconditional support to the Ba'athist regime of Iraq at a time when they were gassing Kurdish women and children. And when we look at the sordid sort of story of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and the way in which, that's not my phone, is it? No, it's not. I thought maybe it's the intelligence services.
They're waiting for us outside.
So all this to say that ISIS is the result of decades of extraordinarily short-sighted, never mind cynical policies of supporting hyper-corrupt authoritarian regimes, of using Islamic fundamentalism as an instrument of power. It's about oil politics, it's about a whole lot of other things. So if on the one hand we're so concerned about that woman that wears the hijab and testifies in court, why are we selling $15 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia, which has a Wahhabist regime? I knew you would join in that.
I love how contemplative, articulate, and persuasive you are. This is a pleasure, and for me, C-51 is a adventure in such entire cynicism. I mean, there's not a scintilla of legitimacy in the position the government is taking. There are ways of dealing with what you have described as untoward events and terrorism. We all know them. There's a lot of material on the books now. But C-51 is a vehicle that opens up doors to oppression of civil liberties, which are terrifying if they are exercised. It's the way in which the audit function in Canada is being used to persecute NGOs with which the government disagrees. It's in the way in which words like radicals and terrorists are being used to describe environmental groups with which a government disagrees. I'm verging tentatively on political issues.
I wouldn't have noticed.
No, well, I thought you were more discerning. But I do want to point out, oh my God, I can't stand it. Let's end this conversation. I do want to point out that the people who have introduced this legislation are running at 30 and 31% in all the polls. That's not enough to re-elect a majority government.
Stephen obviously knew what was happening because I just got the signal to end the conversation. And it has to be done because I don't know how many of you have seen the play that's coming in here this afternoon, but where we are sitting on stage will soon be a pool of water. And so we have to get out of here. I want to thank you all for your questions. They're great questions, and unfortunately we didn't get all of them or even a tiny fraction of them into the conversation. It'll continue after in the lobby, but I want you to join me in thanking these wonderful panelists for opening our window.
Where are you off to next?
Thank you. Thank you. Good.
What a good idea.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Sally, Stephen, and Payam for an exceptional morning. I'd just like to point out a few forum events that are coming up for either jumping off of this conversation or just if you happen to be continuing your visit through the weekend. We do have calendars of all of our events that are in all of our theater lobbies. So this one's just out there. Tomorrow, if you're still here, we have another performance of a concert version of Stephen Sondheim's Passion, which is a four-performance-only thing in series in the Forum. And we're doing a Little Night Music, which is a Stephen Sondheim musical in our season next year. It's a concert that features Cynthia Dale, Alexis Gordon, Stephen Patterson, and other members of our musical company. And it's truly exceptional if you're interested in coming. A week today, so the same time next week, we have leading Shakespearean scholar Stanley Wells is going to be speaking about what makes a Shakespearean actor. He's come all the way from England and is a wonderful speaker and incredible intelligence. This series continues next Sunday with Discovery of the Heart. It features our CBC Massey lecturer Adrian Clarkson, who gave the lecture last year, as well as the playwright of the Pool play, Possible Worlds, John Mighton, who's one of our leading minds in Canadian theatre. He's a playwright, mathematician, and philosopher. And United Church minister turned politician Sherry DeNovo is the panel for next Sunday. That should be another really stimulating discussion. And finally, it's September 3rd, so a ways from here, but if you are local, we have an event called Education for Transformation, which we were going to invite Sally for, and then she was booked for this panel instead. But given the conversation this morning, there's some of you might be interested. Dr. Samantha Nutt, who's the founder of War Child Canada, Marina Nemat, who's the writer, novelist of After Turan and Prisoner of Turan, and historian academic Natalie Zeman Davis are going to be speaking about the importance of educating women in relation to our play The Last Wife, which is the other show playing in our studio season. So that's Wednesday, September 3rd, if you're in the area. There are books for the Massey lectures available for sale in the lobby, and I think that's it. Enjoy the rest of your visit. Thank you so much for coming.
Very enthusiastic.